Hello, I'm Raj Samani, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientist at Rapid7. We've heard a lot about the Supercloud. And in this particular series of talks, you're going to hear a lot about the benefits that the cloud can have. And in fact, the cloud can provide a lot of benefit to organizations. But the one thing that we have to recognize is not only are we becoming more capable as as society with regards to the leveraging of cloud computing, but equally as are the adversaries. In this particular talk, what you're going to hear today is a lot about the use of cloud computing, but predominantly from the malicious aspect. In fact, how the very tools that we use and that we depend upon are being leveraged for malicious gain. And also what you can do in order to be able to identify those particular connections that really should be identified and stopped as quickly as you can, because of course we're going to look at the kill chain with regard to some of these attacks and where the cloud as well as other legitimate enterprise tools are used for malicious purposes. So let's have a look at what we mean by a cloud native adversary. And of course, when we consider the cloud native adversary, one of the examples that we want to leverage is the use of cloud within ransomware attacks. And of course, ransomware has dominated headlines with regards to cybersecurity for some time now. But actually, ransomware in itself is no longer the ransomware that we detected years and years ago, where an email would come inside an environment, somebody would click on a link, and then all of a sudden you've been encrypted. In fact, modern ransomware today really doesn't bear a lot of resemblance with regards to those earlier attacks that we used to witness. And that a lot is in part because we've seen a significant level of innovation from adversaries, partly because we aren't paying, or certainly I wouldn't say we weren't paying, because I certainly think organizations have been paying, and there's multitude of examples with regards to that. But I certainly think we've seen adversaries look to try and identify more ways to extort organizations for as much as they possibly can. In fact, you can recall, when Bitcoin was certainly very cheap, I think it was 2 Bitcoin, which was a couple of $100. We've now seen examples where organizations, demands can reach 10, 15, $20 million plus. And of course, that in part is due to the innovation. And of course, that's the leverage and being enabled through the use of cloud native adversaries. So let's take a look at this kill chain. And in fact, let's use the example that we have at the bottom of this particular screen, the Colonial Pipeline attack. And we know that that was DarkSide. And, of course, DarkSide soon became Black Matter. But as we look at the modus operandi of this particular attack, and in fact, of many of the modern attacks today, what we see and what we witness is this use of, first and foremost, an affiliate model, whereby there is this cybercrime economy, or this ecosystem. This ecosystem allows people with specific skills to be involved in the attack. And with DarkSide, what they were able to do is these affiliates who, may not be coders and developing the ransomware, but are very good at breaking into organizations. And that's kind of what we see today with regards to whether it's Black Matter, whether it's Play ransomware. These types of attacks are enabled because this is cyber criminal economy. The cyber criminal economy itself has a multitude of various different components. And what's interesting is if you look at this, a lot of the tools that they use today, well, in fact, a lot of the tools are actually legitimate enterprise tools. And that makes it considerably harder to detect these attacks because they're not using known bad, they're using known good tools. And it's using our tools that we leverage and use every day against us. And of course, the likes of PowerShell have been talked about significantly, but also we start to see and use, or they start to see and use the use of cloud native tools against us. On the right-hand side, what you'll see is the exfiltration component. And when we talk about exfiltration, that's a a level of innovation that's come about because, whereas historic ransomware would be an attack upon the availability of systems or the accessibility and availability of critical data, what we're now seeing is an attack on the confidentiality of such information. And it works, by the way. A few years back, I received a telephone call from a CEO of a very large organization, and they'd been impacted by DarkSide. Actually, this was just before Colonial Pipeline. And the question that they asked me was, well, should I pay? And of course, my recommendation was always, no, you shouldn't pay. But what changed their perspective and stopped them calling me, quite frankly, was when it was an attack upon the availability of systems. They had a backup recovery plan. But when they realized that actually all of their information would be publicly accessible and publicly available, all of their partners' information would be publicly accessible. So all of the organizations that they work with would be accessible. This would be a huge reputational impact upon them. And what they quickly realized was actually they had no choice but to pay in order to fingers crossed, hope that the adversaries won't publish the information. And that is enabled by exfiltrating data. But of course, the adversaries don't want the data exfiltrated to known bad, because of course, if an organization detects the fact that actually information is going to, for example, bulletproof hosting providers with known bad IP ranges, A, it could be blocked, but B, the organization has the opportunity to be able to determine there's something malicious in their environment and potentially throw the adversaries out before they can conclude the attack. And of course, that's why we're seeing the use of legitimate tools. And one such that we're going to discuss today is rclone. And some of you may well be using rclone today because it is a legitimate tool, much like Real VNC, for example, or even PowerShell for that matter. But what's interesting here is that the information is being exfiltrated to known cloud instances using tools that are used in enterprises today. And just a quick look at rclone today, what you can see, of course, is rclone allows you to back up and encrypt files to cloud storage. And it's not going to cloud services or hosting providers that we know to be malicious. Actually, on the contrary, what we're seeing and we're witnessing is the exfiltration of data to legitimate cloud services. And this is just a very, very quick snapshot of some of the cloud instances supported through rclone. And if you are, for example, an S3 user, how do you determine the multitudes and thousands of connections going to your S3 buckets? And how do you determine which of those connections are malicious and which aren't? Much like the enterprise tools on the previous slide, how do you determine that, for example, that Real VNC connection is malicious as opposed to legitimate? And that's the challenge that we face in cybersecurity today. In the past, cybersecurity was all about blocking the known bad. Of course, that's why we had the rise of the antivirus industry. It was designed as particularly to block known bad. The reason we've seen the growth and rise in heuristics or the growth and rise in machine learning is because the objective is no longer, or rather, so the objective is to identify known bad, of course, but of course then the objective is to identify the known unknowns. It's the things that you don't know about. And of course, this is exactly the challenge that we face in modern cybersecurity today. And predominantly with the leveraging of a supercloud, most organizations today are more than likely to be using more than one cloud hosting provider. And as you use more providers, as you have more connections going to these environments, your challenge today is to identify the difference or identify those that are likely malicious and those that are not. And that's the challenge we face today. And of course, a lot of this is enabled by the fact that the adversaries themselves are able to get legitimate connections. If we stay with Amazon just for a second, we did some analysis recently to identify how many organizations are storing their AWS credentials within their GitHub repos. And you would assume the number will be limited because, of course, the keys to any kingdom are your credentials. And in fact, the Cloud Security Alliance talk about the misuse of credentials as being one of the key and top attack vectors being leveraged by threat actors today as they target cloud environments. So when we had a look and we said, well, okay, how many of these GitHub repos have credentials embedded within them? The number, and by the way, this was a number of years back, the number was actually really quite staggeringly high, 384,328. And of course, that number is probably very different now and it changes regularly. But of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that at this point in time, almost 400,000 credentials were accessible and available. And of course, that enables further malicious usage because no longer are we looking for S3 buckets, or no longer are we looking for connections to bulletproof hosting. We're looking for connections to S3 buckets, and furthermore, we're looking for connections to S3 buckets of legitimate organizations who inadvertently may have made their credentials accessible and available through things like GitHub. And of course, that's not the only example of how credentials are identified and stolen. There are those, I hate the term sophisticated and unsophisticated, but there are the lower level attacks that are still ubiquitous today. For example, phishing. And all of this kind of drives us toward this perspective whereby, and this was taken in 2017, but when Gartner said 95% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault, there is the potential of there being an element of truth to that. And certainly in the previous slide, we see the fact that over 400,000 examples verifying and backing up this particular claim. Now, we'll never know, of course, with absolute accuracy whether this number was correct or not, but we do know that there is a semblance of truth to this. And as I mentioned, we're also dealing with issues around phishing. And phishing still remains a very, very viable attack mechanism. I mean, statistically, less than 1% of people, for example, may click on the link. But of course, if you send enough emails, you get enough credentials. And that's the challenge we face today. And in fact, email and RDP, we talked about ransomware earlier, but email and RDP have remained kind of neck and neck with regards to the most common initial entry vector for attacks for predominantly ransomware groups. And so the challenges that we face today as we leverage and utilize Supercloud, we've still got the low-level, common, high-volume attacks today. But equally, we are dealing with capable actors that are doing searches on known repositories on GitHub, for example, not just GitHub, but other repositories to identify credentials, and are able to take control of legitimate cloud instances, and are able to hide within the multitude of various different systems that we depend upon. And we talk about this low-level attack surface as well, but we have to recognize that security teams today, whilst you've got these shiny lights of cloud instances that we're migrating towards, we still have a huge legacy to secure and protect. I mean, in 2020, it was cited that 25 million systems across the globe still run Windows XP. I'm sure that number has come down since then, incidentally. But regardless of whether that number is 25 million or 22 million today, whatever the number is, regardless, we still have a scenario in which security organizations are having to deal with legacy systems that we've got to maintain and protect. We've got to deal with instances whereby we're having to deal with the low-level noise, such as the phishing emails. And also we're having to deal with very capable attackers as well, all in the guise of the organization, the business demanding that we move towards the adoption of multitude and supporting multitude of cloud instances. And then, of course, that has to be done in the environment whereby we've got SOCs that are overrun, we've got a huge number of alerting that we need to identify and protect and investigate. And of course, we can't hire enough people, we can't hire enough staff. So that's why we're seeing the growth and rise of tools such as MDR, managed detection and response. So those are some of the challenges that we face today. And I think as we try to look and move forward and consider where we are today, we have to acknowledge the fact that we've got innovation coming from threat actors. We've got, in fact, this is actually taken from DarkSide. With DarkSide, for example, they certainly were carrying out development 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. And they had a huge team and a number of people that were actively supporting them. So that's the environment that we live in today, and not wishing to be the person that's only providing negativity or the challenge with security today, quite frankly, is the fact that we have hugely complex systems and hugely complex environments. There are, of course, solutions. There is, of course, research available. There is, of course, products and tools and support and services available. What I would encourage all of you to do is absolutely look and leverage the Supercloud, or look at the cloud as a absolutely viable approach towards managing the compute within your organizations. It absolutely is the right way to approach things. But the cloud, I mean, they say there's no such thing as a silver bullet, and the cloud is just the same. The cloud is not a silver bullet to addressing and eliminating security. Much like MDR, yes, it's a managed detection response, is a vehicle and an approach whereby you can hand over the management of your security to a third party. The responsibility, however, still rests with you as an organization. And therefore, the due diligence that has to be done is still imperative. But that's not to say that MDR is not a viable approach. In fact, for many organizations, for pretty much every organizations, outsourcing a lot of this is going to be critical and crucial. If you're looking at where you move and where you go from here, what I would encourage you to do is go to rapid7.com/research. We've got a multitude of various different resources and research available. Not only that, we've actually got an incredible arsenal of open source technologies that you can leverage and you can use as well. With that, I want to thank you for your time today, and thank you for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I have a couple of questions, so I am going to try to answer them as best as I can. So the first question that I have is, what would be the first approach with regards to, or what would be the, sorry, let me rephrase that. The question is, if I'm going to be looking and leveraging cloud computing, what would be the first thing that I would need to do? And, what I would answer for that particular question is, I'm going to cheat slightly and recommend organizations download and look at industry bodies such as the Cloud Security Alliance. I've been with the Cloud Security Alliance for a number of years now. In fact, I published a book on cloud computing. So that's certainly the one thing you can do. But really, the first paper that was published by the Cloud Security Alliance around the migration to the cloud really talked about governance as being a key focus with regards to migration of cloud or to the cloud. In other words, learn and understand the processes, learn and understand your risk appetite, learn and understand the business's approach to how you manage risk. And then you can start to consider what processes and what systems you can start to migrate and move over to cloud computing. Before you do that, before you actually sign on the dotted line, ensure and understand that you know what you're doing, and then start to ensure that you've got delineation on the responsibilities of what you will be responsible for and what the cloud service provider will be responsible for. From a GDPR perspective, from a data protection perspective, that's absolutely critical, because of course, you are a data controller and you will remain a data controller. And handing things over to a third party on the assumption that they're going to handle and manage everything for you is not, well, it's certainly not going to be deemed as appropriate by the Data Protection Authority. I can assure you of that. There is a principle, for example, in the UK under the Data Protection Act, Principle 7, you still have the obligation to ensure that the appropriate organizational and technical measures are in place. Thank you so much for your time. As we move over to 2023, I can assure you, as you're looking at these types of systems, as you're becoming more dependent on the cloud, Rapid7 has a number of tools, a number of products, a significant amount of research to help you in your journey. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.